Alright, so today I want to show you the biggest losers in ball pythons, and essentially what I'm talking about the ball python morphs that started really high about 5 or 6 years ago, and over the last few years they have dropped significantly in price, pretty much since I started in ball pythons. If you actually go back about 20 years, almost everything was sky high, and I'd say over the last 5 or 6 years, most of the morphs have been pretty stable. There's not really been a whole lot that have really tanked, like dropped significantly. And I'd say it's kind of a double-edged sword, because a lot of times you're thinking, man, I wish I could buy that morph. I wish I could get into that project, but it's thousands of dollars. And a lot of times some of the stuff that was totally out of reach when I first started in ball pythons, now I can finally buy them. They're relatively affordable. Some are really affordable compared to, you know, what they were 5 years ago. I can't even believe that I actually have some of these morphs that were just so far out of reach just a few years ago. And then kind of on the flip side, if I was to actually invest hundreds of thousands of dollars on the wrong morphs 5 or 6 years ago, and say for example if I had a problem, I couldn't get my ball pythons to eat or to breed, you could potentially lose an incredible amount of money in ball pythons. And I think it really helps to be diversified across several different morphs and a lot of different projects, so you really don't take the hit on any one, especially if you're investing really heavy. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to jump over to the internet and I want to show you some of these crazy price drops on some of these ball pythons. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com, and I want to start with the one ball python morph that I've seen lose the most value over the last 5 or 6 years, and that is the scaleless head ball python. The scaleless head looks just like a regular ball python, except it has a few scales missing from the top of the head. If you actually breed two of them together, 25% of the time you'll get a completely scaleless ball python. And this one is an ad from 5 years ago. Take a look at this. This actually sold for $45,000 just 5 years ago. And it was kind of funny, when I first got into ball pythons, someone actually came up to me in the lunchroom when I was working a job, and they actually showed me this snake on a phone. They said, take a look at this snake. I couldn't believe that it was $45,000. And the one I was actually looking at sold within just a couple weeks. I couldn't believe the price, and I couldn't believe that people were actually buying them for that. And this was back in 2015. And it's kind of interesting. It was like a dream of mine to get one of these scaleless heads, and I finally did several years later, and I wanted to show you this price. This is actually one of the newer ads from a scaleless ball python. This is a male scaleless head from 2019 for sale. It sold for $150, from $45,000 all the way down to $150. And on a lot of these morphs, you really have to be on top of things if you actually want to make some money breeding snakes, especially on a morph that drops really fast like this. You have to keep producing these snakes over the years and kind of get your return on investment before it really tanks. I've never seen anything that really drops so fast like the scaleless head. It's pretty unbelievable. And if you're wondering what a totally scaleless looks like, this is a super scaleless head. It has two copies of the scaleless head. It's a totally, completely scaleless ball python. No scales. I haven't actually even felt one of these. I always thought it'd be neat to actually just feel one. They say it feels completely different than a regular ball python, because you strip away all the scales and it just feels like a snake with no scales. It probably feels almost like eel-like, with just like a skin instead of scales. And when I first started in ball pythons, the very first totally scaleless was for sale for $150,000. Now they've come all the way down to, this is one of the cheaper ones. This is actually $2,250. They're still kind of holding their price for the completely scaleless. I would say it's a pretty good project to get into right now. You can actually get into it relatively inexpensive, and it's kind of like a recessive project. Working other genes into it takes a long time, because you need two copies of the scaleless head gene. So some of these, they kind of come down really fast, and then they just kind of level out, and then it's kind of one of the staples of the ball python industry. Here's another one that was kind of interesting when I first started out. As a matter of fact, this was about 5 years ago. This was a het sunset selling for $25,000. As a matter of fact, I didn't even know what a sunset looked like for years. I just saw these het sunsets coming out. I was like, what in the world is a sunset? It's actually a recessive mutation. You need 2 copies of the sunset gene to get a visual. And you take a look at this price, $25,000 versus what they are today. This is actually a female for $900, but you can actually get males for cheaper than that. I pulled up this male for $300. I can't even believe they're so cheap for 100% het sunset male. It's pretty unbelievable. They've come down quite a bit. The visual sunsets are still holding their price. This is actually what a sunset looks like. They're still selling for several $1,000s for a visual sunset. So it's kind of interesting. The hets, you can actually take like a male sunset, breed it through your collection. You can produce a lot of hets really fast, but then in order to get the visual, you actually have to grow up the females, and that's kind of what everybody's waiting for. Like on the scaleless head, I'm waiting for all my females so I can actually get a visual scaleless ball python. You know, it takes usually at least 3 years, sometimes up to 5 years to actually get your females ready. In some cases, you can actually breed them after 2 years, but I'd say it's pretty rare that a ball python will continually eat for 2 years straight and be consistent in the feeding to where they get to the point where you can breed them. But it's kind of interesting that the sunsets were just so expensive and now they've come down so much. It's pretty awesome. Here's another one. This is a possible het sunset. This is actually when they first came out. This was $3,500 just for the possibility that it had 1 copy of the sunset gene. It's not even a percentage, it's just possible. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking like a 50% het sunset and you're breeding it to something else. Then you don't even know if sunset's in the mix, still selling for $3,500. I thought that was pretty crazy right when they came out. As a matter of fact, if you were to get into sunset, I'd probably buy a couple of hets at this point. It's probably the least expensive way to get into the project. Here's another one that's really come down really fast. This is the static. The static combos just a few years ago, not even 5 years ago, were selling. This one sold for $29,000. It's kind of like, I'd say the static is similar to the leopard gene, where it really just breaks up the pattern, really kind of shatters it. And now, you know, you go from $29,000 for a static fire down to about $1,500 for a pastel static. I think the statics are pretty much starting right now at about $1,500. And if you're wondering what the static is, if you look at this, it's not really that impressive, but the telltale sign that you have a static, you can actually take a look at the belly, and the belly is always has a really crazy pattern. And when you start mixing it with other genes, usually it makes some really impressive combos. Probably one of the king of combos for a co-dominant morph. I still haven't seen like a super static. It's pretty new on the market, so it'd be kind of interesting to see if there's actually a super and what that looks like. Here's another one that was really expensive when I first started in ball pythons. This is a bongo. The bongo was new on the scene when I first started. This was actually $10,000, first posted in January of 2015. This is a bongo lesser. It went from $10,000 all the way to $300 just 5 years later. Here is a bongo lesser. Pretty amazing how fast that one came down. I haven't really looked into the bongo that much. It's not really that popular, but it's kind of amazing how some of these morphs just really come down in price. Here's one that you probably have seen these around if you've been shopping on Morphmarket. This is a Pastel Banana clown. Some of the banana clown stuff is really awesome. It's, believe it or not, 5 years ago, these were selling for $6,000. Pretty incredible prices. And I used to look at some of this stuff and I was like, there's no way that I could ever get into this stuff. And here it is a few years later. Here's the same snake for $450. It actually came down within my price range now. I can't even believe I actually bought an inchy banana clown. I think I paid about $1,500. And those snakes, you know, years ago, they were like multi-$1,000 snakes. I didn't think I could ever afford one. And now they've come down to where you can actually get into these projects. It's pretty amazing. Here's another one that was fairly expensive. It wasn't really high end. When I first started, they were actually selling for about $2,500. This is the Toffee, the same thing as the candy. And they're actually compatible with albino, so you can make the Toffinos and the Candinos from the Toffee / candy. And as a matter of fact, this actually went from $2,500. Now you can actually get them for about $400. They've come down so much. It's pretty amazing. I can't even believe you can actually get into a lot of projects now that when I started just 5 years ago, I thought these were just totally out of reach. It's pretty amazing. Here's another one I kind of had my eye on early on, and it's a codominant gene. This is the Cypress. These were selling for $4,000, and this was like 4 years ago, so it wasn't really that long ago. If you take a look at the Cypresses now, here is a female Cypress that sold for $300. It's pretty amazing. And a lot of times you look at this stuff and you're wondering, are ball pythons really a good investment? You can lose a lot of money if you don't actually breed these and produce some offspring in the whole few years before you can actually get the offspring to market. It's kind of risky, but the thing is these are kind of the exceptions to the rule. I actually pulled this snake up over here. This is a dreamsicle sold in, it was first posted in 2016, so it was a few years ago. I actually pulled up some older ones. These were originally selling, when I started, I'd say they're probably about $2,500. This was actually $2,100. And now all these years later, take a look at how much a dreamsicle is actually selling for. $2,250. So the piebald and the lavender albino together in the same snake is the dreamsicle. They're selling for almost the same price as they were 5 years ago. And the other interesting thing is if you have just a straight pied, you know, with the splotches of white, just the base gene, the recessive morph pied. When I first started in ball pythons, I think I was paying about $350 for a pied male and a female. It's like $700 for a pair, and they're almost the same price today. I mean, sometimes you can find them a little bit cheaper, but almost always you see pies holding their value over the long term. And it's kind of funny because they actually started at about $25,000 a piece when they first came on the market, one of the first morphs that really kick-started ball pythons. And here we are after the crash of the pied. It started really high and then it crashed, and then it just kind of maintained, at least over the last 5 or 6 years. Pieds have really been holding their value. So sometimes you can win and sometimes you can lose. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And the Jones family asks, what's the difference between a lemon blast and a lemon pastel? And that is a very good question. This is where it gets a little bit confusing because the lemon blast is actually a slang term for the pastel gene and the pinstripe gene in the same snake. So the lemon blast is pastel pinstripe. And when we talk about lemon pastel, that is completely different. Essentially what that is it's a different line of pastel. And normally when we talk about pastel, most people will actually kind of group all the different lines of pastel into one general term, pastel. As a matter of fact, if you go through and all my collection and all my hatchlings, I actually produce pastels every year. Some of them are really bright pastels, like a really bright yellow, and some of them are kind of browned out. It really depends on which snake I'm breeding. And a lot of people, especially with the pastel, sometimes they'll actually differentiate the different lines of pastel and break them out and kind of look at the origins of where they came from. It's kind of similar to the axanthic, where we have, you know, the VPI axanthic and the TSK and the Joliffe. They're all different lines of axanthic, similar to what we do with the pastel. I'd say most of the times with axanthic, a lot of people have these really clear distinctions about the different lines. And when it comes to pastel, most people don't really break it up into the separate lines, and we just generally call them all pastels. But in some cases, you'll actually get someone talking about different lines like the lemon pastel. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.